What we should do, Lisa, is just take a moment, let Andrew explain the sequence of events from about 2011 from his perspective. But even before we do that, just for the sake of the this particular audience, Andrew, who might not know who you are and your work, if you could spend a couple of minutes just explaining what a galactic historian is, how you got to this role, then we'll jump into the story of sort of 2011 to now, because the timeout Andrew's talking about is something that we've talked about on this show quite a lot. The fact that there's all of this intended action that was supposed to have taken place over last year and this year, all of these quite nasty intentions from people who don't need to be named, and none of it's happened. Okay, they've had the intent, but none of it's played out. And what Andrew revealed on Monday was that there was actually, if you like, kind of an official timeout going on, which is going to end shortly. So,
yep.
Andrew?
The quick background of what I was is when I was 9 years old, I was at a baseball game, and my dad had taken me to the bottom of the ninth inning, tied game, and our team hit a home run. At that point, I downloaded the Akashic records of all 83,000 people in that stadium. And since that point, I've had to understand what the Akashic records were and go through the self-realization process of a neutral perspective without dogmas or political concepts and still co-create a life pattern. As I grew older, I followed different traditions until I finally understood that I must have my own tradition, my own understanding from my own singular perspective. And as I grew into a multidimensional understanding that we are sine waves of energy living in a technology of skin suit, I began to understand what the whole purpose of the Galactic Historian was to literally present our history as completely transparent and as neutral as possible. And leading into the 2011 concept, which Chris was talking about, 2011, we were literally unified onto a single timeline because they had figured out the primary timeline and what was being done in the timeline wars. Since 2011, many of us experienced this called phantom timeline syndrome, where we've been forced into other timelines for so long and that our soul families have been separated by a fine print contract that keeps us in drama and not a non-resolution of karma. We will dream ourselves into these timelines that have ended, and it's been a constant game of whack-a-mole to make sure that we don't manifest our own destruction or don't manifest these alternate timelines. Since 2011, everything has been about presenting propaganda, quite literally. Timeline wars that reach back 50 million years that will trigger contracts in the oldest of souls to bring all of their manifesting power to present a propaganda or a prophecy piece that will bring other soul families into that same concept so we become manifesting beings. So quite literally, Nibiru and all that other stuff, we are the ones that manifest it because of the soul trauma we've experienced and the other destructions of Earth. They're using post-traumatic stress against us. You know, quite literally, the experience of a world being destroyed before is now influencing us to create that out of fear again. And those systems of propaganda and domination and control know the function of the timeline and have been leapfrogging in through timeline with big pieces and parts of themselves to create cell groups of propaganda. So where we're at now, 2012, its whole purpose was to literally bog down the system with all this information so we wouldn't get up and use our collective free will. Also, there's so many ways to perceive this world. It's an unlimited amount. As I've described, what time was. Well, time as a concept, in this world we live in, there's a dimension that exists above us and below us, which is a separate cosine of time. Our sun has another cosine of time, so we actually experience 4 separate realities of time on this planet. And when we come to an understanding that our soul contracts and the incarnation grid has been hijacked, we find ourselves literally in this point to fix our world. We must find out the rotten parts of our soul family that have been using and abusing us over these millions of years and remove our contracts and fine print with them. And that ultimately is the will of freedom that we shall have. There is a resistance of free earth, and that resistance is your free will in a co-sharing, co-creative, procreative way where we start to empower people to understand what a soul contract is, what a soul family is. So we understand that all the oversouls of each of these soul contract families can begin to identify those individual beings that have been inserting fine print into our contract that keeps us in the reincarnation phase instead of an incarnation phase. Reincarnation is a foreign term to this world. It was imported to keep us in domination.
Looks like we lost the call again. Yep, there it goes. So I'll wait for them to call back in and pick it back up. There we go. There we go, guys.
As you're calling back into the show, we are reconnecting you now.
Oh, thank you, Magenta.
Blog Talk has just given us the pleasant message that we have lost. We have lost transcript, and we are reconnecting you now. So hopefully you guys can hear us again.
We can hear you. We can hear you.
Yep, we can
Andrew,
hear you.
are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here. It's ironic
Still
that BTR crashed at that point.
It is ironic. Beautifully timed. Andrew, I have a question for you, because you mentioned the insertion of fine print into contracts, which is something that came up when we spoke earlier in the week. How do they do that? How do they actually weasel into our soul contracts and introduce stuff that wasn't meant to be there?
Well, when we go through the birth canal of the womb, we actually go through the forgetting, and that's contracted in this world right now. That's the actual rule of this world. And that's how we go through this heart-centered based world of resolving karma. We live in what's called the Galactic Ascension Machine. This solar system was built from the ground up. Quite literally, there were dramatic planets spread all over the galaxies that were polluting timelines, polluting karma. So what they did to resolve it was they took the 66 most powerful dramatic planets and put them all into one solar system with a massive oversoul family in the central star. So that created a massive migration of anyone that wanted to resolve karma. Well, the multidimensional beings that figured out what the Galactic Ascension Machine was about began to migrate here and began taking over the incarnation grid by breeding themselves here. These are 6th, 7th, and 8th dimensional beings that were locked out of creating planets or their own suns. So they were so big of entities that they couldn't fit into a single human body. They would make thousands or millions of themselves. These 15 beings actually represented 40% of our total breeding population at one point. And that's how they hijacked the incarnation grid, by breeding with soul families that were of the light order and then allowing dark souls to come in because they were able to hijack the incarnation grid literally, because they were the master breeders of this area. So when you come through the birth canal is where they can read your contracts and insert fine print so that you find yourself in a karmic resolution phase with beings that are not part of your soul family.
Andrew, there's something that you mentioned that I wanted to key in on, and you talked about using your free will choice to end the contract that you have and all that fine print, that was inserted into our soul contracts, that we can use our free will choice in order to sever that contract or terminate that contract. And energetically, like for instance, if somebody were to sign that Declaration of Absolute Freedom, I don't know if you've read it or not.
I have.
Signing something like that, can you explain what that actually does energetically?
In this matrix, it actually doesn't do anything. It has to be done in the soul language. And that's the unfortunate part of how our print language has been hijacked to take our
we lost you.
Power away. We live in a world where you have Arabic numbers. Everything is separate. It's not a unified concept, and that's what's been hijacked. That's where our power's been taken away, and that's why money has a system on it of sacred geometry that redefines where the energy goes, because it's no longer backed by anything that's hard currency. So literally what you write isn't what you write anymore. So it has to be written in a soul language. And the concept is there. It just needs to be taken onto a more of a soul contract basis, and the commercial concepts removed.
I think I need to have a discussion with you about that, Andrew, which we'll do. Won't do that right here and now, but I'm very interested in redefining that particular document in the manner to which you just described.
There are other things that are called spiritual courts of equity that every soul family oversoul. The oversoul of a soul family is someone that leapfrogs through time and makes sure that parts of the soul family are resolving karma or resolving issues, and they actually have the actual data bank of all the soul contracts of the people that are incarnating in those separate lineages. So they are the ones that can perform a spiritual court of equity, that can read out a soul contract in the soul language so the soul understands it in total. And when they get to the fine print part, it's not written in the original soul language, and they can begin to erase those parts from your contracts. And that can be done out loud as an individual, though it must be re-empowered many times, because, again, it's a process, not an event. When you've reached a level of consciousness exploration like me, I've eliminated as many of my negative fine print contract as possible. And the ones I leave in place are quite literally what allows me to exist in this world as a broken contract rules soul.
Wow, there's a whole host of shows in that information. And I'm not too sure whether everything just went